For hundreds of years, history textbooks have presented us with a familiar tale of early modern queens. They were fragile, unstable, or even mad. Historians described them as women too sentimental to rule, too feeble to command, or too eccentric to be reckoned with. But when we delve further, the reality proves multifaceted and much more interesting. Behind the epithets of madness or fragility, many queens were secretly forging politics, guiding diplomacy, and establishing legacies which survived their opponents. Take Isabella of Castile, remembered as zealous but in reality a sharp strategist who built the foundations of Spain's global power. Or Joanna of Castile, dismissed as insane, yet through her children she became the mother of a dynasty that dominated Europe for centuries. Elizabeth of England, portrayed as indecisive, turned her singleness into one of the greatest diplomatic tools of her reign. Catherine de Medici, often cast as a schemer, in truth held a fractured France together through skillful negotiation and patronage. These women were never powerless. They mastered the art of performance, using illness, piety, grief, or emotion as tools to resist pressure and outmaneuver rivals. Their stories challenge us to question not only the way history was written, but also the way we think about power itself. Authority is not always loud, visible, or direct. Sometimes it is subtle, hidden behind veils of expectation, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look again. Hello everyone, subscribers of our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we shall expose myths and decode the hidden strategies of queens who were so much more than the name used for them. Join us as we rewrite their legacy and the reality behind the speculative royal madness. The history of queens during the early modern era of Europe has frequently been framed by tales of their purported madness. Historians, chroniclers, and even playwrights for a long time highlighted instability, moodiness, and unpredictable behavior when depicting particular women who possessed or purported power. This practice defined how they came to be remembered, and for many of them, it gave carte blanche for those around them to ignore their power. The myth that queens were subject to madness produced a narrative not just undermining the individual accomplishments of the women, but also supporting larger concepts of gender, power, and legitimacy during an age when women's rule itself remained contentious. Examining up close how this myth of madness first came into play, for whom, and how it came to stick lets us better grasp not just the women at the focus of these narratives, but also the political realm which rendered such epithets possible and expedient. To come to grips with the myth, one first must consider the context of the early modern monarchy. Power at this time was commonly assumed to be male. Kings were solid, steady, and sane. Women were passionate, weak, and in need of a strong hand. A woman monarch thereby disrupted cultural assumptions. At the same time, she had simultaneously to embody strong authority as well as feminine virtue, a pairing which was virtually inconceivable for her own contemporaries. If she took firm action, she would seem impulsive or erratic. If she did not take action, she would seem vacillating or incompetent. Such a context rendered it not difficult for one's opponents to frame a queen as mad when she took actions which refused to conform to narrow-gendered modes of rulership. One of the most cited figures in this story is Joanna of Castile, often remembered by the label Joanna the Mad. Born in the late 15th century, she was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the powerful monarchs who united much of Spain under their rule. Joanna inherited the crown of Castile after her mother's death, but almost immediately, her authority was undermined by claims about her mental health. Chronicles describe her as jealous, unpredictable, and consumed by suspicion of her husband, Philip the Handsome. Stories circulated about her supposed refusal to bury his body for a long time after his death, with suggestions that she traveled with his corpse because she could not let go. These tales serve to highlight her as irrational, unfit to govern, and driven by uncontrollable passion. Yet, when examined more closely, these accounts reveal more about the politics of her time than about her actual state of mind. For her father Ferdinand, and later for her son Charles, it was convenient to portray Joanna as incapable. Doing so allowed them to exercise power in her name and justify keeping her away from active rule. By presenting her as mad, they secured their own control while silencing her claims to authority. Another case commonly cited when discussing this myth includes Isabella of Castile, Joanna's own mother. Although later hailed for helping finish the Reconquista and for her support of Columbus's expeditions, Isabella was not without criticism for emotional instability. During her own reign, Her enemies described her as extremely devout bordering on fanaticism, or as cold and unyielding almost to a level of cruelty. While not described as mad as her daughter would later be, the beginnings of the pattern of describing strong queens as extreme or unbalanced were not absent. Her strong will and hardness when carrying out her policies could quickly by her enemies be portrayed as irrational sternness when her policies interfered with noble interests or when they challenged authority of the Church. Elizabeth of England, one of the most renowned queens of European history, also stood accused of instability, especially later in her reign. Throughout the bulk of her reign, Elizabeth balanced her image skillfully, developing the image of the Virgin Queen and employing her single state as a diplomatic and authoritarian weapon. However, as she grew older, criticism became more vocal. Commentators portrayed her as vain, irritable, and incapable of controlling her passions. Accounts of her rages, her failure to name a successor, and her alleged paranoia about plots and potential lovers all fed a picture of a woman slipping into madness. Some even proposed a sort of madness for her later years, a handy fiction for those who desired to deny her achievements or seek to erode the heritage of female monarchy in England. These examples highlight a pattern. When a queen displayed determination, independence, or emotion in ways that clashed with the expectations of her time, she was vulnerable to being labeled as mad. This label did not need to be medically precise. In fact, concepts of mental illness in the early modern period were very different from those today. Madness was not understood through clinical diagnosis, but through social perception. To be called mad could mean to be passionate, unpredictable, or resistant to authority. For queens, this label often served as a political tool, a way of undermining their right to rule and shifting power to others. The myth of royal madness also played a role in shaping how later generations remembered these women. Historians, novelists, and dramatists repeated the stories of their supposed instability, often embellishing them for effect. Over time, these portrayals solidified into accepted truth. Joanna of Castile became forever the mad. Her political situation and the manipulations of those around her reduced to a tale of personal instability. Elizabeth was remembered as a brilliant ruler whose later years were marred by decline into eccentricity. Isabella was both admired and criticized for what could be reframed as unbalanced zeal. The repetition of these narratives across centuries ensured that the myth endured, shaping how modern audiences still think about these queens. What makes this myth especially powerful is that it was not merely descriptive but strategic. Declaring a queen mad did more than describe her behavior. It actively reshaped her political position. In Joanna's case, it justified her confinement and exclusion from government. In Elizabeth's case, it prepared the ground for smoother succession by portraying her as past her prime. In Isabella's case, it tempered the image of her power by associating it with extremity. Each time, the myth of madness worked to limit female power, to reassure those uneasy with women ruling, and to reinforce the idea that political stability required male authority. When we examine the historical record with fresh eyes, it becomes clear that what was often labeled as madness could equally be understood as resistance, grief, political maneuvering, or even calculated strategy. Joanna's refusal to step aside for her father or son, for instance, might be seen as stubbornness in defense of her rights rather than irrationality. Elizabeth's emotional outbursts might reflect the immense pressures of rule and the delicate balancing act she maintained rather than mental decline. Isabella's severity might be interpreted as the necessary firmness of a monarch navigating a fractured realm. Yet because these interpretations threatened the established order, it was easier and safer for contemporaries to call them mad. The persistence of the royal madness myth reveals much about how history is written and remembered. Stories of unstable queens feed into broader cultural tropes about women and power, making them appealing for retelling. They also simplify complex political struggles into personal dramas, making history easier to digest. A queen locked away because of madness is a more straightforward story than a queen sidelined by political calculation. A ruler whose later years are described as eccentric provides a neater conclusion than one who simply continued to resist expectations. But in reducing these figures to tales of madness, the richness of their experiences and the seriousness of their political lives are lost. Challenging this myth requires not only revisiting the sources, but also questioning the assumptions built into them. Chroniclers were not neutral reporters. They had their own allegiances and agendas. Stories of Joanna's corpse-obsessed grief, for instance, may reflect more about the anxieties of her time than about her actions. Accounts of Elizabeth's irritability may come from courtiers frustrated by her refusal to name a successor. Tales of Isabella's zeal may reflect criticism from those who suffered under her reforms. By recognizing the political uses of the madness label, we can begin to see these queens not as unstable figures, but as women navigating the nearly impossible demands of power in a patriarchal world. In this light, the myth of royal madness appears less as a reflection of personal instability and more as a mask placed on powerful women to contain them. It provided justification for their exclusion, reassurance for their subjects, and a warning for future generations about the dangers of female rule. Yet it also testifies to the resilience of these women, who continued to leave their mark despite the narratives built to diminish them. Their stories remind us of the need to look beyond the labels, to question the convenient explanations of history, and to consider the deeper forces at work when power and gender collide. The label of madness was not neutral. It was a weapon, one wielded against queens whose authority threatened the order of their world. And though it has shaped the way they are remembered, looking closer allows us to see past the myth to the realities of their rule. The idea that queens labeled as fragile or even mad were wholly sidelined has often been overstated. When looking closely at the lived experiences of early modern queens, what becomes clear is that the very image of frailty, unpredictability, or instability sometimes offered them a unique kind of cover. While the label of madness was undeniably a weapon used against them, it could also create unexpected spaces where a queen could maneuver beyond the rigid structures of power. The myth created distance between her and the central levers of government, but that distance sometimes provided room for her to operate in ways that would have been unacceptable for a woman openly wielding authority. Power, in these cases, did not vanish but slipped behind the veil, away from direct confrontation with patriarchal expectations and into subtler and often more enduring channels. A queen who was seen as fragile could move outside the narrow script assigned to rulers. Where a king was expected to be firm, consistent, and unyielding, a queen burdened with the reputation of unpredictability could bend those expectations. For example, a sudden outburst of emotion or retreat into apparent passivity could, under the right circumstances, be recast as a kind of diplomacy. At courts that were constantly shifting with rivalries, alliances, and betrayals, the queen could use her supposed weakness as a shield, excusing decisions or conversations that might otherwise be deemed inappropriate. A male ruler who broke protocol or played on sentiment might have been condemned as unfit, but a queen under the shadow of madness could disguise calculated choices as accidents of temperament. Such strategies were not limited to the personal level. In diplomatic contexts, queens could exploit the assumptions made about them. A queen described as fragile might be underestimated by ambassadors or foreign envoys, who believed they were speaking to someone without influence or stability. This underestimation could be turned to her advantage, allowing her to extract information or steer conversations in ways that seemed harmless on the surface but carried political weight beneath. The historian who only reads the reports of these envoys, filled with references to emotional outpourings or strange behavior, may miss how those very performances opened doors. Behind the mask of unpredictability, queens sometimes cultivated networks that extended their influence across borders and across generations. Those networks often began within the walls of the court itself. Unlike kings, who typically commanded through formal structures of government and relied heavily on councils and armies, queens found much of their strength in personal relationships. The court was not only a space of official business, but also a deeply social environment, where small gestures, whispered conversations, and symbolic gifts could shift the balance of power. A queen surrounded by attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and confidantes could build a web of loyalty that carried her voice far beyond her own chambers. If the queen herself was seen as fragile, those within her orbit could become her hands and ears, moving through the corridors of power on her behalf. The importance of female alliances in these settings should not be underestimated. The wives of courtiers, the noble women who entered the queen's household, and even the servants who moved between chambers all formed part of a network that extended the queen's presence. These relationships were built on shared trust, on favors granted and received, and on the mutual recognition of vulnerability in a world that was deeply skeptical of women's authority. Through such ties, queens could press their influence in matters ranging from the appointment of officials to the settlement of disputes, often without leaving the protective cloak of seeming fragility. The court may have seen her as eccentric or unstable, but those within her circle knew how carefully she could turn these perceptions into advantages. These alliances were not only domestic, but also international. The marriages of queens' children offered one of the most enduring forms of influence. Even when a queen was excluded from direct governance, she often retained some authority over the education, upbringing, and marriages of her sons and daughters. In a world where dynastic marriage was one of the chief tools of diplomacy, this power could be profound. A daughter married into a foreign court became both a bond and a conduit, carrying with her the values, loyalties, and subtle guidance of her mother. A son whose marriage was negotiated by his mother's network bound kingdoms together in ways that armies or treaties could not achieve alone. Consider how queens who were marginalized in their own realms often re-emerged on the stage of European politics through their children. A woman described as unstable in her homeland might, through the marriages of her daughters, secure alliances that outlasted her lifetime. The children became living symbols of her reach, spreading her influence even when she was confined, silenced, or portrayed as incapable. Dynastic strategy was often dismissed as the natural duty of women, aligning with maternal roles rather than political ones, but in practice it was one of the most sophisticated forms of power available. To arrange a marriage was not simply to follow custom. It was to recalibrate the balance of power across nations, to weave together houses that might otherwise have stood as enemies, and to place one's own bloodline at the heart of international affairs. It is telling that even when queens were painted as mad, their ability to shape dynastic futures was rarely dismissed outright. Fathers, brothers, and sons who sought to control them still relied on their participation in these negotiations, whether openly or behind closed doors. A mother's influence on a child was not easily erased, and it carried into the child's role on the broader stage of politics. Queens who were described as unfit to rule could still be trusted, or compelled, to guide the matches of their heirs. The irony is that what was framed as a limited domestic duty often proved more lasting than the public achievements of male rulers. Armies were defeated, treaties broken, and territories lost, but the bloodlines created by these queens endured, shaping the political map for centuries. The story of Joanna of Castile again serves as a sharp example. While her confinement and the repeated emphasis on her madness reduced her formal power, her marriages and those of her children created the Habsburg dynasty's dominance over much of Europe. Through her, Spain became tied to the empire of her husband Philip, and through her children, the network of alliances spread across the continent. Joanna herself may have been described as irrational, but the dynastic web she helped create was one of the most rational and effective mechanisms of long-term political strategy in her age. The irony is stark. The woman called mad was the very figure whose offspring defined the political landscape for generations. Elizabeth of England, too, though never married, used the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic weapon throughout her reign. Her supposed indecision, her reputation for emotional outbursts, and her reluctance to commit to any suitor have been interpreted as signs of instability. Yet, seen through another lens, this prolonged performance of fragility allowed her to keep foreign powers in suspense and to manipulate their expectations. By dangling the possibility of union, she forced kings and princes to treat her as an active player, never fully closing the door on alliances, but never surrendering her independence either. The narrative of a vain, aging queen may have appealed to detractors, but the reality was that she turned her singleness into one of the most effective diplomatic strategies of her age. What emerges across these cases is a portrait of queens who, though constrained by narratives of madness or weakness, were far from powerless. Their authority often moved in subtler ways, flowing through networks of women, through family ties, and through the manipulation of perception. The very myths used to contain them sometimes created the conditions for their maneuvering. A queen could not openly wield the sword of her kingly counterparts, but she could work behind the veil, shaping decisions, guiding relationships, and leaving her imprint on the structure of European politics. To say this is not to romanticize their struggles. The label of madness carried real costs, from confinement to slander to the erosion of their legacies. But it is to recognize that power does not always reside where official narratives place it. The myth of fragility could coexist with real influence, sometimes even enabling it. These women lived in a world that sought to diminish them, but they found ways to make that very diminishment serve their ends. Their apparent weakness became, in some cases, their most effective disguise. If we follow the thread of their influence through children, marriages, and alliances, it becomes clear that the power of queens extended beyond their lifetimes and beyond the limits imposed by their contemporaries. The myth of madness may have obscured their achievements, but the outcomes of their strategies remain visible in the dynasties that ruled, the treaties that endured, and the cultural memories that continued to shape nations. Even behind the veil, their power was real, and it reshaped the map of early modern Europe in ways that no chronicler's dismissive label could fully erase. The notion that queens were powerless victims of accusations of fragility or madness begins to unravel further when we look at how some of them intentionally leaned into those very perceptions for their own ends. What had been used as a tool to confine or discredit them could, under certain circumstances, be reshaped into a deliberate strategy. To feign weakness, to claim illness at an opportune moment, or to stage a dramatic display of grief or piety was not merely an act of desperation. It could be a calculated performance meant to resist pressures that could not be opposed directly. In this way, queens transformed the language of frailty, the expectations of emotional instability, and the rituals of public suffering into a political toolkit that allowed them to navigate the very structures that limited them. Marriage was often the most pressing and inescapable source of political pressure placed upon queens. For a woman who inherited the throne, her marriage was not merely a private matter of affection, but a decision that carried immense consequences for her realm. A husband could easily overshadow her authority, and his foreign alliances might draw her kingdom into conflicts against its will. For Elizabeth of England, this reality was at the center of her reign. From the beginning of her rule, she faced constant pressure to choose a husband, with suitors ranging from domestic noblemen to princes and kings of Europe. Yet she resisted for decades, and one of the tools she employed to maintain that resistance was the careful performance of fragility. Reports of her falling into fits of distress, withdrawing from court life, or citing physical weakness at critical junctures allowed her to deflect negotiations without outright rejecting them. In such cases, what appeared as indecision or instability to her detractors may have been a deliberate strategy to keep her options open while ensuring her independence remained intact. Elizabeth's body itself became a stage where political drama played out. She was, after all, constantly under the gaze of ambassadors, courtiers, and envoys who reported every detail back to their masters. A sudden illness could delay negotiations by her time or unsettle her opponents. When she appeared in tears or frustration, this was not necessarily the sign of a failing ruler, but of one who understood the power of emotional display in a world where sincerity and manipulation were often indistinguishable. By leaning into expectations of female fragility, she gained the space to refuse what she could not openly deny. The strategic use of illness was not unique to Elizabeth. Queens across Europe recognized that claiming poor health at the right moment could serve as a shield. A woman who collapsed at a council meeting, who retired suddenly from negotiations, or who confined herself to bedchambers during a heated dispute could avoid being forced into a decision without appearing openly defiant. Illness softened resistance. It turned what could have been viewed as rebellion into something more acceptable, a natural consequence of the female body or of delicate nerves. In a patriarchal culture, this framing often allowed a queen to maintain her dignity and avoid direct confrontation, even as it bought her time to regroup or recalibrate her strategy. Yet the performance of weakness was only one side of the coin. Queens also knew how to wield public displays of piety, grief, and distress to their advantage. In times of crisis, when the loyalty of subjects was uncertain, these performances could consolidate support and win sympathy in ways that sheer authority could not. A queen who fell to her knees in a chapel, weeping for the safety of her people, or who walked barefoot in a procession of penitents, signaled not only humility but also shared suffering. Such acts blurred the line between ruler and subject, binding the queen to her people through the language of devotion and sacrifice. Isabella of Castile, remembered as a deeply pious ruler, made frequent use of public rituals of devotion. Her critics portrayed her piety as excessive, even fanatical, but these performances also connected her to her subjects in ways that bolstered her authority. By appearing before them not as a distant sovereign, but as a woman visibly humbled before God, she claimed a moral authority that was difficult to challenge. In moments of war, famine, or unrest, such displays reassured her people that their ruler was suffering alongside them, seeking divine guidance for their sake. Piety in these cases was not mere devotion. It was a form of political theater that reinforced legitimacy. The strategic use of grief was equally powerful. When a queen lost a husband or a child, the public mourning that followed was not only personal but political. To be seen weeping openly, to retreat into seclusion, or to wear black for extended periods was to embody the collective sorrow of the realm. Such gestures won sympathy from subjects and reminded them of the humanity of their sovereign. At the same time, grief could also be wielded to delay political decisions or to consolidate loyalty around the figure of the mourning queen. Joanna of Castile's story illustrates both the risks and the potential of this strategy. While her prolonged attachment to her husband's body was later weaponized against her as evidence of madness, in its earliest moments it may have been a deeply symbolic act that proclaimed her devotion and reinforced her identity as his legitimate partner. What began as a political gesture of fidelity was later reframed as insanity, revealing how fragile the line between performance and pathology could be. The court, ever a theater of appearances, amplified the performative aspects of queenship. Every gesture, every word, and every sigh carried meaning for those who watched. Queens who understood this reality could turn it to their advantage. By carefully staging emotional displays, they influenced how they were perceived by allies and adversaries alike. A well-timed outburst of tears could soften a hardened counselor. A fainting spell could break up a hostile meeting. A display of anger could intimidate or unsettle a rival. These acts were not mere outpourings of uncontrollable emotion, but carefully placed performances within a political drama. The performative nature of queenship was not limited to crises. It was woven into daily life, into the rituals of court and ceremony. A queen's body was constantly on display, scrutinized for signs of fertility, health, and moral virtue. In such a setting, she could not afford to leave interpretation entirely to others. By staging how she appeared, whether through illness, piety, or emotional expression, she could shape the story that surrounded her. This required a fine balance, for overplaying the role could backfire, as it did in Joanna's case. But when performed skillfully, it became a tool as potent as any army or treaty. This aspect of queenship highlights a deeper truth about power in the early modern world. It was never only about brute force or formal authority. It was also about perception, symbolism, and narrative. Queens, constrained by gendered expectations that denied them the full exercise of kingly authority, turned these softer tools into weapons of their own. To cry at the right moment, to pray in the right place, to fall ill at the right time. All these were part of a repertoire of strategies that kept them in play even when others sought to sideline them. At its core, this use of strategic illness and performance challenges the simplistic view of queens as victims of circumstance. They were not merely acted upon by narratives of fragility. They could also act through those narratives. The very stereotypes that limited them could be reshaped into shields and levers of power. Their lives remind us that politics is not always conducted in council chambers or on battlefields. Sometimes it unfolds in bedchambers, in chapels, and in the carefully staged display of emotion. In these spaces, queens carved out forms of agency that remain visible in the legacies they left behind. And yet, even in recognizing this agency, we cannot forget the precariousness of the strategy. To perform weakness was to risk being seen as truly weak. To stage grief was to risk being branded as unstable. To feign illness was to risk losing credibility altogether. The success of these performances depended on timing, context, and the willingness of audiences to interpret them in favorable ways. A queen who miscalculated could find herself confined, like Joanna, or ridiculed, like Elizabeth in her later years. But those who mastered the performance found in it a powerful means of survival and influence. This understanding of queenship as performance also forces us to reconsider how we read historical sources. The ambassador who described a queen collapsing into tears, the chronicler who noted her retreat into seclusion, or the courtier who whispered of her strange behavior may not have been witnessing raw emotion, but rather a scene carefully staged for their benefit. To take these accounts at face value is to miss the possibility that the queen herself was the author of the drama, directing her own story in a world eager to write it for her. When we piece together these strategies across the lives of queens like Isabella, Joanna, and Elizabeth, a pattern emerges that complicates the myth of royal madness. What appeared as instability may often have been intentional, what looked like fragility may have been calculated, and what seemed to be weakness may have been power in disguise. These women, constrained by patriarchal expectations, learned to work with the tools available to them. And in doing so, they demonstrated that the stage of monarchy was as much about performance as it was about governance. Their example continues to resonate because it reminds us that power often hides in unexpected places. To pretend to faint, to weep, or to pray might seem trivial compared to leading armies or signing treaties. But in the context of early modern queenship, these acts could carry consequences that shifted the course of dynasties and altered the fate of nations. The performance of illness or emotion was not a retreat from politics, but another way of practicing it, subtle, dangerous, and profoundly effective when handled with care. In the world of early modern monarchy, the image of queens as fragile figures, either trapped in illness or performing emotion to navigate pressure, only captures part of the reality. Their roles extended beyond their bodies and their private chambers into the wider realm of diplomacy and patronage, where the language of influence was more subtle yet equally decisive. The connections between their kinship networks, their religious commitments, their cultural sponsorship, and their ability to maneuver through court politics created a sphere of power that could rival, and in some cases redirect, the formal authority of kings and ministers. To understand the true depth of queenship in this period, it is necessary to trace how they moved across the international stage, not as silent partners, but as active participants whose patronage and diplomacy left lasting marks on both their realms and the broader European order. One of the most important ways queens entered diplomacy was through their familial ties. In an age where treaties were often sealed with marriages and alliances were woven through bloodlines, queens embodied those connections in living form. They were sisters, daughters, mothers, and aunts to rulers across Europe, and these identities gave them a unique position to act as intermediaries. When negotiations grew tense, it was often the queen whose letters or personal presence softened the atmosphere. Her correspondence could bridge divides where formal envoys failed, precisely because she was perceived not only as a sovereign but as kin. Unlike male ambassadors, who spoke in the rigid language of contracts and territorial claims, queens could frame their interventions as appeals to family loyalty, Christian duty, or maternal concern. These forms of persuasion, less confrontational yet deeply binding, carried weight in ways that political arguments alone could not. Isabella of Castile provides an early example of this dynamic. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon united two powerful kingdoms, and while Ferdinand is often remembered as the architect of the alliance, Isabella's role in sustaining and legitimizing it was just as crucial. She wrote letters to foreign rulers, personally oversaw the education and placement of her children in strategic marriages, and used her reputation for piety and strength to secure trust from allies and subjects alike. Through her daughters, she bound Spain to Portugal, Burgundy, and England, laying foundations for a web of alliances that extended well beyond her lifetime. Each marriage carried risks and opportunities, and Isabella managed those risks by staying actively engaged in negotiations, sometimes even overriding her husband's preferences when she judged them to be against Castilian interests. Joanna of Castile, though sidelined by her father and son under accusations of madness, nonetheless played a central role in the creation of the Habsburg dynasty's international dominance. Through her marriage to Philip of Burgundy and through the unions of her children, she connected Spain to the Holy Roman Empire and, by extension, to a vast continental network. Even if she was not permitted to rule openly, her bloodline itself became the backbone of European politics. And while historians often describe this as an accident of her position, it is important to recall that queens frequently played an active role in arranging, approving, or at the very least shaping these matches. Joanna's reputation for instability obscured the fact that her maternal influence and dynastic position altered the course of European politics more profoundly than many kings of her age. Elizabeth of England, though famously unmarried, also demonstrates how queens used their personal status as a diplomatic tool. By keeping her hand in marriage negotiations without ever committing, she effectively held the courts of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire in a state of uncertainty. At times, she used these proposals to extract concessions or to influence the balance of power on the continent. Her refusal to marry may have been portrayed as eccentricity or vanity, but it was also a masterstroke of diplomacy. She transformed what might have been seen as a vulnerability, her unmarried state, into a constant bargaining chip. Her single body became a space where international hopes and fears collided, and she kept that tension alive as long as it served England's interests. Beyond marriage and kinship, queens exercised influence through patronage, which was far more than mere sponsorship of culture or religion. Patronage was a political language, a way of signaling values, rewarding loyalty, and projecting power. When a queen funded a convent, she was not simply supporting piety, but cultivating a network of clerical allies who could speak on her behalf in pulpits across the realm. When she commissioned a painting or a play, she was shaping how her subjects imagined her, embedding her image in the cultural memory of the nation. When she extended favor to scholars, she promoted ideas that could reinforce her legitimacy or advance her policies. Isabella of Castile again stands out as a queen who understood the reach of patronage. Her sponsorship of religious reform not only reflected her personal devotion, but also reinforced her authority over the church in her realms. By aligning herself with reform movements, she projected herself as a guardian of faith, which strengthened her position in a deeply Catholic society. Her support of Columbus's voyage, though sometimes attributed solely to her piety or curiosity, also reveals a shrewd calculation of the potential benefits of exploration and expansion. Patronage in this case extended beyond art or religion into the realm of science and geography, embedding her legacy in the very foundations of Spain's imperial identity. Elizabeth of England used patronage in a different, but equally effective way. She cultivated poets, playwrights, and musicians whose works glorified her reign and reinforced her image as a divinely chosen, almost mythic ruler. Through pageantry, masks, and plays, she allowed her subjects to see her not just as a political figure, but as an icon. Patronage thus became a form of propaganda, an orchestrated effort to bind loyalty through culture. Her use of imagery, from portraits that emphasized her eternal youth to performances that celebrated her as both mother and virgin, was deliberate and politically charged. These cultural productions were not idle entertainments but tools of governance, shaping the emotional landscape of her realm. The patronage of queens also extended to military and policy matters, though often in less visible ways. Queens who funded troops or provided resources to campaigns did so under the guise of loyalty to their husbands or sons, but these gestures often gave them leverage in shaping military strategy. A queen who raised funds for a campaign could expect her voice to be heard in the councils that followed. Similarly, queens who secured alliances through their kinship networks often had a hand in determining the direction of foreign policy. While they may not have signed treaties themselves, their letters, interventions, and family connections shaped the terms under which those treaties were made. Catherine de Medici of France provides a clear example of a queen whose patronage and diplomacy allowed her to influence policy directly, even from a position that seemed secondary. As the mother of multiple kings of France during a time of religious conflict, she acted as a mediator between Catholic and Protestant factions. Her use of patronage extended to both sides, offering favor to nobles, generals, and clerics who might otherwise have torn the country apart. While her legacy is often clouded by accusations of manipulation or cruelty, particularly after the massacre of St. Bartholomew, her role demonstrates the political weight a queen could carry by using the tools of diplomacy and patronage to hold a fragile realm together. Queens also shaped succession plans, often from positions that appeared indirect. Their influence over their children, their guidance in matters of marriage and inheritance, and their ability to build coalitions of support around particular heirs all gave them a decisive role in determining the future of their dynasties. Even when sidelined in public, they could work behind the scenes to ensure that the child most favorable to their interests succeeded. This was particularly evident in courts where multiple heirs vied for power, and the queen's alliances with courtiers, nobles, or foreign powers could tip the balance. The performative aspects of queenship that we have already traced, illness, piety, grief, and emotional display, blended seamlessly with these diplomatic and patronage strategies. A queen who appeared in public as a grieving mother could rally sympathy for her son's claim to the throne. A queen who prayed openly for peace could strengthen her position as mediator in international disputes. A queen who claimed weakness at a moment of political crisis could avoid being forced into premature decisions while still guiding outcomes behind the scenes. Performance and diplomacy were not separate arenas, but interwoven aspects of the same political toolkit. Seen in this light, queens were not merely passive figures caught in the swirl of male politics. They were active agents whose influence reached into nearly every sphere of governance, though often in forms that traditional histories have struggled to recognize. Their diplomacy was often familial, their patronage cultural and religious, and their performances emotional, but all of these were political in the fullest sense. The power they wielded may have been indirect, but it was no less real. Through their actions, they shaped policies, secured alliances, and even altered the fates of kingdoms. What is striking is how often their contributions were later dismissed or reframed through the myth of madness or fragility. Joanna's grief was recast as insanity. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was described as indecision. Catherine's balancing act was painted as manipulative cruelty. Isabella's zeal was remembered as fanaticism. Yet beneath these labels lies the evidence of queens who knew how to operate in a world determined to underestimate them. They used every tool available, marriage, kinship, patronage, performance, and diplomacy, to leave legacies that still define the contours of European history. The story of queens in the early modern period, then, is not one of helpless victims or eccentric figures trapped by circumstance. It is the story of women who, though constrained by patriarchal structures and often burdened with labels of instability, nonetheless wielded power in complex, creative, and lasting ways. They understood the stage upon which they lived, and they acted with both calculation and conviction. Their diplomacy secured treaties, their patronage shaped culture, their performances garnered sympathy, and their strategies of illness or grief bought them time and space. Together, these acts remind us that power is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it moves quietly, behind the veil, in the guise of weakness, or in the gestures of devotion and sorrow. Yet it is power all the same, and its traces remain in the alliances, institutions, and cultural narratives they left behind. The story of early modern queens, when pieced together with care and patience, reveals far more than the common tropes of fragility, eccentricity, or madness that were used to contain them. Their legacy, though unsung or even buried under hostile narratives, deserves to be seen in its full richness. What we encounter when we step back from the prejudices of chroniclers and detractors is a tapestry of resilience, intelligence, and creativity in the face of structural limits. These women were never granted the same freedom as kings. They lived in worlds where a woman's claim to authority was constantly scrutinized, undermined, or mocked. Yet despite these obstacles, they carved out enduring forms of influence. The very myths designed to diminish them cannot erase the profound mark they left on the history of Europe and beyond. To reframe our understanding of these queens, it is useful to look again at the lives of Isabella, Joanna, Elizabeth, and Catherine, not through the labels attached to them, but through the strategies they employed. Isabella of Castile, remembered often for her zeal, was in fact a ruler of formidable skill. She took a fragmented realm and forged it into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Her reforms of administration, her commitment to strengthening the crown's authority, and her ability to navigate a partnership with Ferdinand without being overshadowed all speak to her intelligence. She recognized that religion could serve as a unifying force, and while her choices have been rightly critiqued for their harshness, they also demonstrate a keen awareness of how power functioned in her world. She was not driven by irrational zeal, but by a deliberate calculation that bound her realm together and prepared the ground for Spain's rise as a global power. Joanna of Castile, forever branded as the Mad, becomes an entirely different figure when we strip away that label. Her confinement was not the inevitable result of an unstable mind, but the outcome of political maneuvers by her father Ferdinand, her husband Philip, and her son Charles, each of whom benefited from her exclusion. Her supposed obsession with her husband's corpse was less a definitive fact than a story repeated by those who wanted to justify her removal. What remains undeniable is that her bloodline defined the Habsburg dynasty, and through her children the political map of Europe was redrawn. Her legacy is not one of madness, but of maternal resilience. Even in the face of confinement and slander, she preserved her dynastic role, and through it she shaped European politics more profoundly than many who sat on thrones without challenge. Elizabeth of England, so often remembered as eccentric in her later years, stands as an example of how performance itself became an art of governance. She understood that her body, her singleness, and her image were tools of power. Her refusal to marry was not weakness, but independence dressed in the language of hesitation. Her emotional displays, her piety, and her occasional withdrawals from the public stage were all part of a repertoire that allowed her to resist pressures that might have overwhelmed another. She cultivated loyalty not only through policies but through symbols, transforming herself into an icon whose memory continued to inspire long after her death. The golden age of her reign was not the product of a fragile or unstable woman, but of a ruler who mastered the tools available to her and wielded them with unmatched precision. Catherine de Medici, too often cast as a schemer or poisoner in popular imagination, reveals another dimension of queenship's legacy. As the mother of French kings during a time of religious strife, she walked a path so narrow that failure at any step might have destroyed her family and her realm. She turned patronage into diplomacy, offering favors to both Catholic and Protestant nobles to prevent the kingdom from collapsing into endless war. She orchestrated policies, balanced factions, and shaped the succession of her children. Her legacy is distorted by sensational stories of cruelty. Yet beneath those tales lies the reality of a queen who held a fragile realm together when others might have watched it collapse. The long-term impact of these queens cannot be measured only in their lifetimes. Isabella's choices laid the groundwork for Spain's empire, stretching across oceans and shaping the modern world. Joanna's descendants carried her legacy into centuries of Habsburg rule, from Spain to Austria, from the Low Countries to the New World. Elizabeth's reign gave England not only stability, but also a cultural identity that would carry into its later imperial expansion. Catherine's balancing act allowed France to survive one of its most perilous eras, setting the stage for the eventual consolidation of royal authority under later monarchs. Each of these women, despite the myths and distortions, left behind a structure of power, a lineage, or a cultural identity that continued long after their own voices were silenced. It is also important to consider how their strategies influenced the very idea of queenship for those who followed. Later queens, whether in England, Spain, France, or elsewhere, inherited not only crowns but also examples of how to navigate the contradictions of female power. The performances of piety, illness, and grief that earlier queens had perfected remained part of the political toolkit for centuries. The reliance on patronage as a form of governance continued, with queens using their sponsorship of art and religion to shape narratives about their rule. The emphasis on dynastic marriages, carefully managed and strategically deployed, remained central to European diplomacy. These were not isolated acts, but patterns of governance developed by women who refused to be erased. The fact that their contributions were so often minimized tells us much about how history has been written. Chroniclers and historians, overwhelmingly male, shaped the stories to fit the expectations of their time. A queen's anger was interpreted as hysteria, while a king's anger was strength. A queen's grief was seen as instability, while a king's grief was humanity. A queen's piety was fanaticism, while a king's was devotion. These double standards ensured that the same behaviors praised in men were condemned in women. The myths of madness, fragility, or manipulation became convenient shorthand that explained away their successes while excusing the hostility they faced. Yet when we question these narratives, when we read against the grain of the sources, a different story comes into focus. We see resilience where others saw weakness. We see strategy where others saw indecision. We see intelligence where others saw instability. These queens lived in worlds that sought to contain them, but they refused to vanish. Their names endure, even if distorted, because they were too significant to ignore. The task of history now is to restore their agency, to recognize the fullness of their contributions, and to celebrate the creativity with which they turned constraints into opportunities. The unsung legacy of these queens is therefore not only about what they accomplished in their lifetimes, but about how they force us to rethink the nature of power itself. They remind us that authority is not always about visible command. It can also be about influence, performance, and the ability to maneuver in spaces where others believe you are powerless. Their stories challenge us to reconsider what counts as political action and to acknowledge that acts of survival, resilience, and subtlety can be as transformative as battles and treaties. As we reconsider their legacies, it is worth reflecting on how they continue to shape our own conversations about gender and leadership. The narratives that painted them as mad or fragile are not relics of the past. Versions of these same labels still appear when women in positions of power today are described as emotional, unstable, or unfit. The persistence of these tropes shows that the myths surrounding early modern queens were not only political tools of their time, but also enduring cultural scripts that continue to shape how we think about women and authority. To study these queens is therefore not only to correct the record of history, but to interrogate the present, to ask how much has changed and how much remains the same. The invitation, then, is to look again, to revisit Isabella not as a fanatic, but as a strategist. To see Joanna not as mad, but as a victim of political manipulation whose legacy reshaped Europe. To see Elizabeth not as eccentric, but as a master of performance. To see Catherine not as a schemer, but as a stabilizer of a fractured realm. To give these women back the dignity of their intelligence and the recognition of their agency is to tell history more honestly. It is to acknowledge that their achievements were not accidents, but deliberate acts of resilience. History is always written from particular perspectives, shaped by the voices that survive and the prejudices of those who record them. To accept those accounts uncritically is to allow distortions to persist. But when we question them, when we seek out the traces of agency hidden beneath accusations of madness or fragility, we open space for richer, truer stories. The queens of early modern Europe deserve that recognition, and so do we as readers of history. Their unsung legacy is not only in the empires, dynasties, and cultural identities they left behind, but also in the challenge they pose to us. To rethink what power looks like, to question who gets to define it, and to resist the easy stories that obscure complexity. The hope is that by engaging with their lives in this fuller way, we not only recover their place in history, but also spark further conversation. Each of these stories is an invitation to dig deeper, to ask new questions, and to reconsider the assumptions we bring to the past. The legacy of these queens is not fixed in the labels imposed on them, but alive in the questions they inspire. They compel us to see beyond the myths, to challenge conventional narratives, and to recognize that the margins of history are often where its most enduring lessons are found. Their resilience, their intelligence, and their creativity deserve celebration. They were not symbols of weakness but of endurance, not relics of madness but architects of survival. Their contributions, once dismissed, are now revealed as central to the making of modern Europe. To honor them is to honor the complexity of history itself, and to remember that the stories most often silenced are often the ones that matter most.